Hello and welcome to our first climate and land use webinar. We are going to start at 12:02. My name is Takara Nicole Thomas, and I am so happy that you all are able to join us today. I am joined by Joseph Mendaka, Catherine Burgess, Jeff Richards, and Bridge Rauch. And again, just a reminder, we're going to start precisely at 12:02. Nice to see you, Bridge.
Hello, all.
All right, it is 12:02 p.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. This is our climate and land use webinar, and I'm going to share my screen, slideshow. Zoning reform for climate action. Thank you for joining us, Smart Growth America, as we do a deep dive today on the interactions between zoning reform and climate action. Before we get started, this is a webinar that is hosted by our Center for Zoning Solutions program. This is the newest program for Smart Growth America, launching in October 2024, where we come and produce and share and innovate innovative solutions to unlock economic prosperity and housing for all in America. We today are going to learn how to apply the SGA priority of climate change and resilience in your local context. And we're going to also talk about a sneak peek of our climate migration report. So we really want to just kind of start before that to tell you about the rest of our webinar series. This is webinar number 3 as part of our series. All webinars are submitted and eligible for AICP certification maintenance credits. As they are approved, we will endeavor to update you all via email and our website about how to obtain those credits, but we just wanted to flag that you are eligible for them by attending these webinars. And just a recap, as I mentioned, this is webinar number 3. The first webinar that we kicked off was zoning for reform for equitable development outcomes. We heard from Elevated Chicago and the Parking Reform Network. We also heard from Kingston, New York, about how do we actually develop actionable zoning reform to get those equitable development outcomes that we want. I also want to flag that Kingston, New York was the recipient of this year's Form-Based Code Award. Their code was highlighted for having strong equity forward focus and a housing forward focus baked directly into the code. Our second webinar was zoning reform for healthy communities. This is where we talked about the intersections between health equity and land use and how zoning reform can be a tool to unlock healthy communities for all. We heard from our friends Health Equity Zone in Newport, Rhode Island. We also heard from John Robert Smith about his time at Meridian, Mississippi, where he put the entire city on a diet. And we talked about those actions that you really can use to advance health equity for your community. And today we're talking about zoning reform for climate action. I'm not going to get too deep into that one because you're going to hear from our experts about that topic. And as I said, each of these are eligible for AICP. We are having more webinars, so this is not the only ones in our series. Next up in order, we'll talk about land use and accessibility. How can we make the world, starting with America, accessible by all by changing land use to change the built environment? Then we hear planners as change makers. How can and should planners use land use zoning as a way to change our world? And then we'll come in with a sneak peek. We will unveil a brand new resource hub, Zoning for Housing. This will be all and everything that you want to know about how do you unlock housing supply via zoning reform. Then we'll end our season with learning about how community-based organizations can tap into the affirmatively furthering fair housing and land use to advance housing supply, and also why we should still continue to follow AFFH, even though it might currently be under attack. We still think that the ethos of it is a good spirit to follow. So that's our webinar series. We will share the dates as they are firmed up in advance of those dates. And as usual, all of our webinars in our series will be eligible for CM credits. I also wanted to kind of talk through some other things. What zoning is a nuanced conversation. And we want to really dig into how do we use that zoning nuance to unlock quality of life. So one of the things we'll talk about is how do you use zoning reform to reduce emissions. We'll also talk about how people can answer the call and demand change in their communities. It's not just for technocrats. Zoning is here for all of us. Then we'll talk about zoning reform for adaptation. How can you use this free resource in climate and land use planning to make sure that everyone is comfortable in the face of climate change and climate now? And that is what we're going to kind of talk about. I also want to do some light housekeeping. We are using the Zoom webinar format. So please use the Q&A function to share your questions. We will have question and moderated discussion towards the later portion of today's webinar. And then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions directly to our speakers. But given that this is a Zoom webinar format, we will not moderate the chat. We might have some spot checks throughout, but all questions, if you want them directly to go to the speakers today, you need to use the Q&A function. We will have time for Q&A for Jeff Roberts. He unfortunately has to drop shortly after his presentation, but we have ensured that there is time to make sure that we can get direct questions to him. And then, as I mentioned earlier, again, we are going to submit everything. All of our webinars are eligible for CM credits. So now I'm also going to introduce all of our speakers at once so we can get into the meat of our conversation. I am joined by Catherine Burgess, who is the Vice President of Land Use and Development here at Smart Growth America, where she oversees SGA's land use programs, including LOCUST, the Center for Zoning Solutions, the National Brownfield Coalitions. And prior to Smart Growth America, Catherine led the Urban Resilience Program at the Urban Land Institute. At ULI, she built up the organization's program of work, addressing how buildings, cities, and communities can be more prepared for the impacts of climate change. So we are joined by a real climate change heavy hitter. We are also joined by Joseph Mendaka. He is our Climate Program Associate on the LUD team. In this role, he supports SGA's research and TA work in partnership for local community-based organizations from across the country. His main interests are affordable housing and climate justice and the relationship between them, another climate heavy hitter. Then we'll be joined by Jeff Roberts. Jeff Roberts is the Director of Zoning and Development for the City of Cambridge. He has worked in the Cambridge Community Development Department for over 20 years with a focus on community planning and urban development. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees from MIT in urban studies and planning, and I am very excited to hear Jeff's conversation today. We're also joined by Bridge Rauch, completing today's team. Bridge Rauch, Dave M., is an organizer for the Clean Air Coalition of Western New York and Buffalo, New York-based organization, which works with fence line residents and workers at industrial facilities to fight for environmental justice and public health. They have a master's of regional planning from the University at Albany and have 15 years of experience in the nonprofit sector in Buffalo. Wow, we're going to hear about climate change and climate resiliency from New York. So with that really wonderful slate of speakers, I am going to turn it over to Captain Burgess.
Go back to the slide. Thank you so much, Tokara, and thanks for your leadership standing up the Center for Zoning Solutions. We are so excited to bring together SGA's many longtime and new resources on zoning reform. And I think this webinar series has been a great way to kick off the new center. I'm Catherine Burgess, and I'm excited to provide some upfront framing on some of SGA's work on zoning reform for climate action. And I'll say, as a nonprofit organization, we really seek to make connections across different fields, across different levels of government, and to be a resource to advocates, city staff, and all of you on the call today. So please do feel free to follow up afterwards, share feedback, and share what types of resources you're looking for, because we are really eager to be responsive to that. So before we dive in here, I'll share, while we're looking, primarily at zoning reform opportunities at the municipal level, we have one free resource which rolled out earlier this year, which looks at the state level, the Climate and Land Use Planning Guide, which we completed in partnership with the U.S. Climate Alliance. This is a policy guide which looks at strategies for land use policy to impact climate action, both in terms of reducing emissions, as Takara led with, and encouraging adaptation, so better preparedness for climate events, which continue to grow more frequent and intense. So please feel free to check this out. Amongst other things, it looks at strategies for state level zoning reform to direct development to well-connected locations where households can rely less on single occupancy vehicles and more on transit and getting around by bike, by foot, and rolling. Next slide. So I think as we sit here at the very start of hurricane season and the start of a summer, which I have no doubt will continue to break records, unfortunately, around extreme heat, we have seen increasingly damaging and dangerous hurricane and heat seasons over the past few years. And in fact, NOAA, which has been tracking the costs of these events, as of this week, is likely to no longer be tracking this data. So take a look at this data as we have it now. There is a significant amount of damage and human harm to buildings, to infrastructure, to people, to businesses on account of climate and weather events. Next slide. And then, if you look also at insurance data, the numbers have only gone up. Again, we as people and as communities, and as households and cities are more and more facing those risks, and we are vulnerable to the impacts of these hazards. Next slide. Yet, despite this increasing damage, we are seeing development continue to move forward in locations that face significant climate risk. This might be development in the floodplain, the wildland-urban interface, and other locations where the households are likely to face continued exposure. So today we're really zooming in on how can zoning address these issues. There are also many other ways to support households in harm's way and also to reduce future development in harm's way. Next slide. So today we're going to look at a real case study at the city level from Cambridge, and then from the community advocate perspective at how zoning can advance climate action, both in terms of emission reductions and also in terms of preparing for climate events, everything from storms to heat to wildfire risk and drought. We can also share some other recent research we've completed looking at the city of Norfolk, which has really been an early vanguard in terms of preparing for climate impacts. Their approach to climate-informed zoning took a very proactive strategy to incentivize development in locations which are less flood prone and to reduce development in locations which are riskier. And we did a fiscal impact study, which not only looked at the impact to construction, but also the impact to property values, and found that this approach did not lead to a short-term negative property impact in the sites which were deemed to be riskier. And that is always a big question that is hanging above an initiative like this. So, we stand facing an incredible challenge, and we really are eager to work with all of you and the larger community through Center for Zoning Solutions and Smart Growth America to think about how can we direct development to locations, which will be more prepared for future climate impacts. How can we address the housing access crisis? The extent of housing need is more significant than it's ever been. And how can we both be more prepared for these events and also be prepared for how the world may change in terms of where people choose to live, where people and businesses choose to move. So these are a lot of interconnected issues. And with that, I'm eager to introduce you to my colleague, Joseph Mendonca, who will be previewing a new resource, which SGA will be rolling out next month, and which we would be happy to share first with a group of attendees from today's webinar. Thanks, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So like she said, we are soon to be releasing a new report focusing on smart growth strategies for climate resilience in aspirational climate havens. It's a lot of buzzwords, but basically the background for this is that according to estimations from First Street, there are going to be 55 million Americans relocating around the US because of climate risk. And that's going to be, if that turns out to be true, that's going to be the largest migration in American history. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to go ahead and start preparing for that. Next slide. And a lot of the places where people may move are these sort of climate haven communities. I just want to quickly point out that places like Asheville are on there. Asheville was one of the climate havens until, was it last year or the year before? It flooded. So there's nowhere that it's truly a climate haven, but there are places that have less climate risk that people will still be kind of moving to. So this map shows a lot of places that have self-proclaimed themselves as climate havens, and maybe other places that have been commonly labeled by researchers as future climate havens. Next slide. There we go. And these communities need to prepare for population growth while also protecting their current residents, because a lot of these communities, as you saw, are in the Rust Belt, they're Midwestern, they're Northeastern cities. They're using the climate haven label to kind of galvanize economic and population growth, right? But they need to do it, they're not doing what they need to be doing in order to prepare for all these people that may come. Next slide. So we have 3 main recommendations for aspirational climate havens and places like them. We're saying you should probably be prioritizing for housing initiatives that connect housing, transportation, and amenities, especially because if you bring a lot of people in at once, it's going to raise your housing costs, and that's going to, likely wind up displacing people in addition to being a financial burden for a lot of households. We're recommending that climate havens strengthen their social infrastructure because they need to foster community building for both people who live there already and for people who will be coming in. And we're saying climate havens need to recognize and prepare for climate hazards. Like I said, there's nowhere that's going to be a true climate haven. You're never going to be able to be free from climate risk. So you need to take steps to protect people that are living there. And especially if you're telling people to come there, you need to protect them as well. Next slide. So for prioritizing pro-housing initiatives, we have a couple strategies that I want to go over that I figure you zoning people would love. One of our strategies is enacting comprehensive zoning reform to increase housing supply and promote mixed-use development. And then another is protecting longtime residents from displacement with tools like inclusionary zoning or tax abatements. Next slide. So for zoning reform, I wanted to highlight, I'm sure there's many examples that have happened, but one of them I wanted to show was Boise's in Idaho. So they did a comprehensive zoning reform back in, I think in 2023, and now they allow duplexes and some multiplexes on all residential land in the city, which is a stark difference from the prior zoning code where 80% was solely single family zone. They also made it easier to build ADUs, reduce parking minimums, and reduce minimum lot size requirements. And just 3 months later, they already saw a huge jump in housing construction, primarily ADUs, but still quite notable. Next slide. And then as for protecting longtime residents from displacement, I wanted to talk about Portland's inclusionary zoning policy, or as they call it, inclusionary housing. They combine it with tax abatements. So they basically say if you're building multifamily housing, you should put 10 to 20% of the units in there as affordable, and you'll get a certain tax exemption for it to kind of offset those losses. And so they included the tax abatements in their policy in March 2024, and it's now estimated to yield around 300 affordable rent restricted homes per year. Next slide. And then as for our recommendation on recognizing and preparing for climate hazards, one of our main ones is using climate informed zoning. Catherine already talked a little bit about Norfolk, and I'm gonna show you a little bit about Charleston. And then another recommendation is updating building codes to higher resilience standards. Next slide. So climate informed zoning, Charleston, they have this whole sea level rise planning strategy, and they took a look and they said a lot of our land is low lying, especially downtown where we have a lot of people, a lot of assets. So they went ahead and created a new base zoning code in the Upper Peninsula where they found that there would be a little bit less flooding risk. And they rezoned basically a bunch of industrial parcels, and they said you can have height and density bonuses here if you provide some sort of community amenity, whether that's building to green building standards or providing affordable housing or something like that. Basically, they're using this as a tool to kind of promote development away from areas that are higher risk. And then next slide. And then resilient building codes. California, I know, wildfires. That was a thing, right? But California actually does have pretty stringent building code standards, especially post 2008. And studies have actually shown that the houses that were built to these standards have much better survivability rates when it comes to wildfire. A lot of the housing in California was not built post 2008, so those are primarily the ones that are getting damaged, but the resilient building codes are making a difference. Next slide. And that quick overview, land use interventions like these and many others that we have in the report that you might get a sneak peek at are critical for building prosperous and resilient communities, including for aspirational climate havens. Next slide. And with that, I'll pass it off to Takar or Jeff. To Jeff then.
So Jeff, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to you. You are able to share your screen.
Fantastic. Thanks. While I'm doing that, let me just say thank you for having me here. I'm joining you from the zoning offices here in sunny Cambridge, Massachusetts. Can anybody tell me if you don't see slides? Okay, good. Apparently we're seeing slides. It's great to be here with SGA. I've kind of just not that long ago gotten familiar with the work that you're doing here. It's great to be part of it. You know, here in Cambridge, we're kind of working on the front lines of a lot of the issues that you're talking about with this group. So it's really interesting to see what's coming out of it. I spent a lot of time lately talking about housing and zoning. So it's kind of interesting and refreshing to go back to something that we worked on not too long ago, but a little bit of a couple years ago. This has really been an interesting thing for me to work on as a planner, I think, because it's an example, and I've talked about this before, but it is an example of some real, truly forward-looking urban planning. A lot of the planning we do really is like we're responding to a lot of immediate issues. But in this case, we really were taking a hard look at things that we see evolving over the next 50 years or more, and focusing on being prepared for how things are going to change over time. So I'll just start by talking about sort of how we got here, and I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. I always say your zoning is only as good as your planning, so there's a lot of background to this that I'm really not going to get a chance to talk about. I think, looking at the previous presentation, you can see there's a lot of planning work going on, a lot of thinking that goes into resilience and how to look at the risks that different communities face and how to kind of break that apart into different types of risks and think about different kinds of solutions, many of which are zoning and many of which are not zoning. But I encourage you, if you really want to dig deep into this, to look at the work that Cambridge has done and that our sustainability team has done and our public works department has done on looking at different kinds of climate change vulnerabilities and impacts. Brief story of how we got to talking about this from a zoning perspective. I think that how the processes start is really informative in terms of how the processes end up. So way back in 2017, it was a different time, the city had started working on its first phase of looking at climate change and resilience planning. This was the first edition of what we now call the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. It was a very hard, very data-focused look at what we anticipate, how we anticipate the climate changing based on regional climate models, and then how exactly do we see that affecting the city of Cambridge. So that came out, and just as it was coming out, or just after it came out, a group of residents in the city, and Cambridge has very, very active, engaged residents, they proposed an amendment to zoning And it basically took from the climate change vulnerability assessment, but it threw in a lot of requirements that would apply to development, and it would apply development in lots of different areas of the city. And it would impose requirements that kind of triggered a bit of a reaction among the development community, particularly the affordable housing development community that kind of looked at this proposal and said, it's great that we're thinking about resilience, but wait a second, we think that this feels more like a sort of cynical attempt to try to block housing production in the city. And it became very contentious. The petition ultimately failed at our city council, but it led to the city council, wanting to address the issue and asking the staff to convene a stakeholder group to develop zoning recommendations based on this climate change vulnerability assessment. So as a result of that, the city put together this group called the Climate Resilience Zoning Task Force. This was a group that worked kind of in parallel while resilience planning was going on more broadly within the city. And this group put together, people who were on various sides of the debate over how we should be regulating development, particularly housing development in the face of impacts from climate change. And this group was armed, I think, with very good resources, both from staff and also the consultant support that was behind our resilience planning. There was a clear scope in terms of what this task force was intended to do. And so they got to work shortly after this sort of debate in 2017. The process took a long time to play out. There was an impact from COVID as we had to kind of prioritize how much sort of gathering was taking place and how we were engaging on these discussions. But we finally got to a set of recommendations in sort of 2001, 2002 that then led to development of an actual zoning proposal that was ultimately adopted in 2023 and became effective then. So we don't really have we don't have a lot of implementation experience of this, but we're starting to get some decent experience under our belt based on having maybe a year and a half now of implementing these standards. And in terms of the task force process, if there was one overarching theme to it, it would be that we want to set clear expectations for the future in terms of development, but we don't want to overly constrain choice. The focus of this group was to take a really hard look at the risks from climate change, to center people's health and well-being as the main priority that we're trying to focus on. And because our planning, which I won't get too deep into, basically doesn't suggest that Cambridge should abandon parts of the city due to climate risk or try to discourage development in particular areas. What we were focused on with this group was developing standards that are actually feasible for property owners and developers to meet, so that they would actually have a real impact on securing future development against risks rather than preventing future housing development. So now we'll get into the zoning itself. This is just some detail about what the zoning changes were and where they land in the zoning. There's a link to our zoning ordinance in case you want to get under the hood and read the zoning itself to understand a little bit better how it works. But the way it basically breaks down is that we created 2 new sets of standards that apply to all new buildings in the city. And I'll talk about those, the flood resilience standards and the heat resilience standards. And then we also looked at how some of our current zoning requirements at the time could be changed in a way that promotes resilience. And this is something we look at a lot in our zoning. And we increasingly find that as we impose new requirements on our zoning, it's important to think about what requirements we have in place that can be dialed back, either because they might get in the way of the goals that we're trying to achieve, or simply because it's becoming too onerous to have all of these requirements. And so we need to prioritize what are the things that we really care about. So I'll talk about the flood resilience standards first. It requires a little bit of background into the planning work that we did on flood risk. So Cambridge is not a coastal community, but it is impacted by storm surge flooding that comes up our river systems and by precipitation-driven flooding. And the city was able to model future climate impacts on flooding using both the regional climate models that a lot of other communities are sort of relying on to think about things like coastal flood risk, but also using the city's relatively sophisticated public works infrastructure modeling process that allows us to look at impacts due to precipitation. And those impacts are more scattered throughout the city. You know, we're looking specifically at like if a certain amount of rain is going to fall in the future due to climate change, how well can our infrastructure handle that? And as a result, what kind of flooding risk might we see? So as a result of all of this, the city developed what we call long-term flood elevations. So these are based on the approximately 50-year climate models that have been developed. They're a departure from they look similar to, but are not really the same as the FEMA flood maps that we also have to account for. But as those look to historical incidents of flooding, these are really looking forward and setting projections for what is anticipated to happen in the future. And for convenience, this whole model and these long-term flood elevations are made available to the public. What we call the Cambridge Flood Viewer tool. So that's something you can look up, and any of you can look at the city and see where these different flood risks are projected. They get updated periodically over time as the climate models change and as our infrastructure models change. So if infrastructure gets improved in some parts of the city, that will affect what our projected flood risks are. We acknowledge that not all communities have developed this robust resource, and that a lot of what we're doing in our zoning really depends on having this resource available. Some communities have taken other kinds of approaches, and that's great. But if you have the resources and the planning that allows you to do this, then you can really do a lot with your zoning. The way that our standards are applied is relatively simple. So we have a 10% probability future flood risk, which is essentially the design elevation for new development. So occupiable spaces in a building have to either be elevated above that 10% probability, annual probability risk, or have to be protected with some kind of a passive protection like flood barriers. We then have the 1% probability. We refer to that as the recover elevation. So essentially what that means is that especially vulnerable spaces like habitable residential space, bedrooms and such, have to be protected. Critical building systems like electrical systems have to be protected from that 1% annual risk. And other occupiable spaces need to be recoverable, meaning that if there is flooding in that area, that flooding can be managed without having to, for instance, close down big sections of the building or have to do some major rehab work in order to fix it. And this is a graph that we like to include in our presentations. We've gone back to this a lot. It's really just math. There's nothing kind of empirical about this. It's just saying, like, what is the difference between a 10% probability and a 1% probability flood risk? And really, the difference is that a 10% annual probability risk is something that over 30 years, so basically like the lifetime of a building, or even less than a lifetime of a building, is very likely to happen. So, and even likely to happen multiple times. So if you have a 10% annual flood risk, you're looking at, you're expecting that there is going to be flooding at that level. When it comes to the 1% probability flood risk, it's maybe not guaranteed that that's going to happen, but the concern there is that if it does happen, we don't want it to have a drastic impact. Like, we don't want that to be displacing people from housing over long periods of time. So that's why we've kind of focused on setting these different standards at these different probability levels. The second piece of our resilient zoning focuses on heat. And so because one of the principles of the effort was to center human health and well-being, our planning tells us that increased heat is going to create some of the most severe health impacts from climate change. So we took an idea which is not necessarily a new idea. It's a performance-based scoring system for site design. We call it a cool score. It's based on something other communities have used, which they might call a green score or something like that. As far as we know, this is the first example of where we've used this, and have done it specifically to mitigate urban heat impacts. So the weighting of this scoring system is meant to encourage site design features that are known to have the best impact on mitigating urban heat impacts. So the most points in this system go towards things like tree preservation and planting. There's a little bit less weight towards lower scale plantings, green roofs, other types of less intensive greening. And then there's additional points for things like structural shading, cool paving, other things that are important so that we can promote cooling where plantings aren't going to be feasible on a site. So again, this is all some work that we did that was only made possible by the fact that we have this very robust planning resource and information available to us that studied what the impacts of heat will be and how we can mitigate those things. Not to go over this in detail, but just to highlight how important implementation is to all of this. That was a big part of the zoning effort, and it's a big part of all of our zoning. The zoning, if you look at it, lays out a clear kind of step-by-step review process at different stages of development that something would have to go through. Staff have worked on deploying tools to make the process as smooth as possible for design and development teams to follow. One of the tools we find really successful is creating templates that people can follow so that it really makes it as simple as possible. It also makes the review process a lot easier for us. So feel free to reach out to us or look on our website if you want to learn more about how we implement these things. And then just briefly, there were a set of zoning changes meant to make resilience features easier in zoning. We removed impediments, so trying to exempt things like shade canopies, elevated features, green roofs, from some of the dimensional standards that might in zoning that might make those difficult to achieve. I won't go over this in detail. So to sum up, this the zoning change was a result of a lot of work by a lot of people. It sets some innovative new standards, but there's a balance between setting new standards and providing additional flexibility for property owners and developers. To borrow a little bit from what the planning board said, our planning board, when they reviewed this was really a remarkable example of how a group of people with very different points of view, but armed with very deep knowledge of an issue, can help to coalesce and provide some practical solutions to some very complicated problems. So that's it. And I will stick around as long as I need to answer questions, but I will have to jump off at some point to get to another meeting. So thank you very much.
Jeff, that is a perfect segue. Thank you for queuing that up. We thank you for sharing your expertise and being willing to stay on for Q&A. So we are going to ask everyone to please submit questions to Jeff via the Q&A function. And with that, I have a first question from Catherine.
Jeff, thank you so much for such a great presentation. You packed so much in there, and I think the Smart Growth America team will listen a second time when we're not also doing a back of house webinar. So I think you've given us an amazing intro to how Cambridge has applied climate resilience to zoning. And Cambridge also has made national headlines this year for whatever you might call it, whether it is pro-housing or YIMBY progress on multifamily by right citywide. So I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts around how these two types of approach reform link together. Yeah, that's the big question, given the headlines from Cambridge this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I probably talked more about that in recent months than I've talked about this. But for those of you who aren't familiar, back in February, the city adopted some zoning reform that I and my team had been working on for a while, and that essentially I refer to it as kind of a stripping away of a lot of requirements that some people would kind of put in the category of exclusionary zoning requirements. So we eliminated, well, one of the first things we did is, previously our zoning had zoned different parts of the city differently. So we had some single family or two family only districts. We changed everything so that it's all, we're zoning uniformly across the city, no minimum lot size requirements, no minimum or maximum unit, dwelling unit requirements. So really simplifying a lot of our zoning. And I think it speaks to what I said in the presentation a little bit earlier that, I think in zoning, there's a lot of time spent thinking about, well, what are our planning objectives? And then looking at zoning as kind of a set of requirements that you can impose to try to get to a particular outcome. And we try to think of it more as what kind of adjustments that, looking at your zoning policy as a whole and looking at all the different things that impact development and trying to think about prioritization, like what are the things that we really care about? How do we want to set our requirements to make sure that we're centering our zoning requirements on the things that are most important to our planning and not keeping, some things that, maybe in the 60s were important to people, but maybe aren't as important to us now. But often those things tend to stick around in zoning ordinances just because, often it's politically very difficult to remove them. I think in terms of the multifamily zoning and in terms of climate resilient zoning, I think both are examples where the leadership of our city council and our political leaders is really crucial. They were the ones that when this came up in 2017 said, wait a minute, let's take a pause. We're concerned about climate resilience, but we're also concerned about housing development. Let's, send this to a group of people who are kind of on, both sides of the issue and see if we can, kind of get to a place where we can come up with some reasonable solutions that work for everyone. So that was successful. And, most recently this year, we're kind of looking at it from a perspective of saying, well, let's look at it the other way and say, what do we have in our zoning ordinance now that we think is really not meeting our current housing goals, and how can we, strip those things away and keep the things that we really care about? So that, I think what's telling is that despite the fact that this recent zoning change was really about how do we make housing, how do we remove impediments and make housing easier to develop, one of the things that wasn't touched was the climate resilient zoning. I think that's where the city council said, and very deliberately said, and the people who were some of the strongest supporters of this recent zoning change said, this climate resilient zoning is really important. Let's keep that in place, and let's, maybe get rid of some of the things that that we're less concerned about now, like having, a maximum, density limit on the number of units. Like if the goal is to create housing, why are we limiting the number of housing units that can be put on a lot?
Wow.
So that hope that answers.
Can you say that again, Jeff? Because the impetus of this webinar is to give actionable tips. So I think that was a really powerful mic drop moment for the group and for the recording. Can you repeat that last thing that you just said about limits?
Yeah, so I mean, the only thing we can do in zoning really is limit things, right? We can put rules that say, you can't do this, right? We can't really force anyone to do anything. When we use, tools, we use sort of incentive-based tools to say things like, well, we'll allow you to do this if you also do that. And so prioritization is really key. The city council in this recent, multifamily zoning change said, there's certain things, we want to promote housing. So if we have things like, minimum lot sizes or minimum lot area per dwelling unit that are getting in the, or, restrictions that only allow single family or two family housing types, like, or if those are things that are getting in the way of our goals, let's deprioritize those things. Let's put them aside, but let's keep the things that we really care about. We still care about climate change. We still think it's important to make sure that our new housing development where it gets built is protected from future climate risk. And that was the whole purpose of this climate resilience effort, was to say, we don't want to be building new housing in a way that housing, that the people who live in that housing are going to be at risk of being displaced, or that the city at large is going to become less habitable because increasing temperatures are going to make urban heat unbearable. So let's center those things in our planning and make sure that those requirements stay in place while deprioritizing some of the things that are not meeting our current goals.
Wow, you all have just done so much, and the chat is going crazy. So I'm going to jump in. We have time for a few more questions. And I'm going to give you rapid so we can make sure we get some in. The first one, how are you educating the public about your climate-informed zoning? The second one, how did you tackle the public realm aspect in conjunction with this? Or was that something that your transportation public works team worked on separately?
I'll start with the last question, as I always do, because it's the easiest one to remember. And then I'll probably ask you to remind me the other one. Yeah, so zoning, is kind of a separate world from our looking at our public infrastructure, but the city is just as serious about that as they are about zoning. Obviously the city has more direct control when it comes to looking at the public realm. But that is, there's still that issue of prioritization. One of the things that's really crucial in Cambridge right now, and is probably besides zoning for housing, is probably the other big controversy that we're dealing with is changing infrastructure for bicycling and reprioritizing bicycling and walking in our streets. And that leads to a whole other set of discussions and priorities about, like, well, how much space are we allocating for bicycling to make sure people can do that? There's obviously climate benefits to having more people using non-auto forms of transportation. At the same time, we have to think about what's the impact that might have on trees, on plantings within the public realm. If you've ever been to Cambridge, the streets aren't that wide. They weren't really designed to, in some parts of the country, you have like wide roads that you can put all kinds of, plantings and bike lanes and traffic lanes and other things. But in Cambridge, it's very limited real estate. But that's an important consideration. That's one of the people who work in infrastructure have to balance all of those things. I think when we talk about our parks and open space, that's another big one where, we have Cambridge has lots of very small parks, and trying to balance, how much of that space is being dedicated to things like recreation, playing fields, courts, playgrounds, how much of it is being dedicated to plantings, trees, and how can those things be integrated through good design? So I used to work in open space planning and park design before I kind of moved to zoning. So that's sort of near and dear to my heart. And I remember that being a big central issue in all of our park planning, is how to kind of get all of those things to work together. And it's, I think, like everything planning, it's about balance. It's about where do you set the balance and all the different priorities that you have.
Wow, Jeff, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us. I see that you shared your contact information on the
Yep.
slide. So I'll ask formally so everyone can hear. If we had some questions for you that we couldn't get to during the webinar, would you be open to answering them offline and us sharing them out via recap?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I can get back to you, or somebody on my staff can get back to you. And there's a lot on our webpage, so including the zoning ordinance itself. So if you just want to dig into anything, if you want, there's a whole website. I didn't put it on these slides, but there's a whole website for our multifamily zoning. So if you're interested in reading more about that, you can look up information about that. And yeah, any questions, just let me know.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We really appreciate it. And now we're going to transition to Bridge. But before we do that, you kind of said something. I have to make the joke because I wouldn't be the moderator extraordinaire that I am. You called out the zoning ordinances on your website. I would hope so, because if it wasn't, that would be all for naught, right? So again, thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I know that I'm a wonk, but even listening to your presentation, you kind of demystified it and talked through a lot of technical elements. And I think there was a lot there for everyone to unpack. So again, thank you so much. And now we're going to transition to Bridge, and Bridge is going to tell me about their experience with climate-informed zoning from the community-based organization.
All righty, let's see if I do this correctly. Y'all should see my slide. Do you see that, or do you see my screen? Okay, all right, good. So I can actually see my notes. That's good. All right, so let's start off for a sec about, like, what do we mean by environmentalism, right? Within the United States, much of the mainstream context, at least within the American context, has been really focused on conservation, which has some, problematic aspects. There's some great aspects. Everybody loves, like, going out to the woods and such, but there's also, like, a strong emphasis on a colonialist-based, like, framework with conservation type movements. So as the Industrial Revolution kicked into high gear, the need for urban planning to protect people from the pollution became apparent to everybody. It was not something that could be ignored anymore. But this wasn't always approached with an equity lens, nor with that environmental context. It was mostly as a public health measure, right? Which was aimed to make lives better for all, but in practice, largely focused on moving those with the means away from pollution sources, and often meant that those who could not afford to move or were not allowed to live in other areas were left behind. And it also sometimes involved just thoroughly leveling like entire neighborhoods, to make space for like beautiful city type designs. So fast forward to the early 1990s. This is a quick definition of environmental justice from Dr. Robert Bullard. And it's taking the environmental context and putting it within a civil rights context. So recognizing that, when we make these decisions about siting of facilities or like where these residential neighborhoods are, it doesn't always mean that that it's being cited equitably, and that there are certain communities, especially Black folk and low-income folk, who disproportionately are impacted by these siting decisions and these zoning decisions. And it also very explicitly calls out environmental racism within these development decisions. That the modern environmental justice movement is really rooted in acknowledging and addressing environmental racism. So what do we mean then by climate justice? So in the 90s and 2000s, when we talk about climate change, or as we used more in that period, global warming, it was often with that save the polar bears type conversation. Again, a very conservation focused framing. But by the early 2010s, there was a growing shift among advocates towards more of a climate justice framing. It was building off the work of environmental justice organizing, and also integrating the just transition framework, which we'll talk about in a minute. And also just recognizing that some communities were being impacted first and worst by the impacts of climate change. So quick summary of those points there. Climate justice and environmental justice are interconnected, but they're also separate ideas. And it's sometimes, but not always, the same communities. We use the term fence line communities for environmental justice areas, like folks who live right next to the fence line of industrial facilities. And you also hear the term frontline communities when you talk about climate justice, is that these are the people who are on the front line of climate change. You can see there in the middle, there's a little Venn diagram of some of the overlap. But the one that I mentioned just before is just transition, is a big overlap with these two movements. So what do we mean by just transition? This concept originated from the labor sector in the 1980s, as workers began to recognize that the old fossil fuel-based economy was beginning to come to an end. And it's since widely been adopted in environmental justice and climate justice circles. We wanted to retain unionized workforces while we made this green transition. So here's a few short as well as long definitions on the screen, as well as this really great visual from Movement Generation that I really love when explaining explaining just transition. The summary that I personally really appreciate is change is inevitable, but justice is not. Basically, we have to confront the challenges that are coming our way with certain intent and direction, such as working to retain those unionized workforces, but also taking steps to address and not repeat the harms of the past and the present. Okay, so Western New York, quick visual for to help us orient. Here is Lake Ontario on the top, Lake Erie on the bottom. And the confusing thing is that the river actually flows from south to north. And Ontario is lower in elevation than Erie is, which led to leads to the creation of Niagara Falls. Just a quick visualization of how big Niagara River is. Here is the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, and you can see the semi truck on the bridge there, just to give you kind of a scale of how big we're talking. So here's Buffalo at the bottom, Niagara Falls at the top, and again for scale, here is Niagara Falls, and myself and a couple coworkers standing on the edge of the falls to kind of give you a visual in your head of just how big this is and how powerful this river is. So on the bottom there, we also have Buffalo Harbor before the creation of the Welland Canal, just across, in Canada. All of the shipping that was going to the lakes, you would come through New York, through the Erie Canal to get, to this industrialized harbor. You can see it's not a natural harbor. It's got that very clear square shape to it. And it was a very from the very beginning was very industrial a harbor front and water area. And we'll talk about Bethlehem Steel, which is just to the south of this in a second. So, up in Niagara Falls, like all that power meant that there was a need and ability to harness all this hydropower that was coming from there. So Niagara Falls by the early 1900s was seeing a ton of industry that was popping up, and also some very experimental industry. So early plastics and chemical experimentation was happening in Niagara Falls by the early 1900s. 1941, U.S. enters World War II, and things really kick into high gear with industrialization in Western New York. Bethlehem Steel that I mentioned, just to the south of the city of Buffalo, was the world's largest steel manufacturer during World War II. It built the steel that built the ships, that built the tanks and the planes, and everything else that helped the Allies win World War II. It was also a period where, it also led to like the industry that was along the Niagara River being supercharged. In particular, the River Road corridor that I work specifically on in the town of Tonawanda, kind of lies between Niagara Falls and Buffalo. This industrial corridor really exploded in size at that period. And there was also a lot of experimental and research work that was happening in this period, including kicking off the modern plastics and chemistry industry. It really kicked it all into high gear, as well as the original research for the Manhattan Project. So this heavy industry, it was there before World War II, but it really kicked into high gear with World War II, and would continue through the 1950s and into the 60s before we began a long period of deindustrialization. All of this history is before the modern regulatory context. So EPA and OSHA, for example, wouldn't come along until the 1970s. So, all of this was being done, just with with a very much under regulation, and very little in the way of just basic environmental regulation, or and certainly not within environmental justice context. So just for a quick visual of what this pollution was like, here is a recent photo of Buffalo City Hall, right downtown town. Definitely check it out if you're ever in the area. And here is Buffalo City Hall in 1970. Sandstone, which is what the facade is made of, is very porous, which means it absorbs air pollution. So when when the Clean Air Act came along, it kind of gave us the ability to rein this in and get this stuff, and get City Hall scrubbed clean. But it's a very stark visualization of what the region was like when these regulatory agencies started to come along. Okay, so all that in our heads, let's talk about environmental justice and climate justice in Western New York. Again, here's our satellite map, but let's zoom in on Buffalo. So there's a lot of neighborhoods throughout these areas, a lot of overlap, but very basically, there's 4 main neighborhoods. There's the east side, the west side, North Buffalo, and South Buffalo. And that yellow line there is where Main Street runs. Here is the map from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation of all the registered large air pollution sources. If you're thinking big smokestacks from an industrial site, this is what we're talking about here. Here's one of all the sites where there's a brownfield or Superfund cleanup that's been completed or is ongoing. It should be noted that's not all the contaminated sites in Buffalo. It's just the ones that have been entered into those programs. And here's one of all just the various scrapyards in the city. You might be picking up a little bit of a pattern at this point. But before we get to that, let's pivot to the climate impacts. So as mentioned, Buffalo is often thought of as a climate change haven, but there are definitely communities that are being harmed by climate change, right here in Buffalo and Western New York. So for example, here's a satellite image depicting the heat in Western New York. The brighter the area, the hotter it is, especially during summer. So it kind of maps, you can see it's rural areas versus urban areas. But if you notice, that Main Street divide is very clear, even from this satellite image, that you can see to the west of that line, it's cooler, to the east, it's hotter. Here's the tree inventory map of Buffalo. Dark green means more trees, light green means less trees. The code on this one is a little screwy, but this is the tree vacancy map. So the pink represents the larger end where there's more vacant spots for the trees could be planted, whereas the orange and the purple areas represent that there are fewer vacant spots as far as where trees can be planted. And here's the FEMA flood risk map of the city. The Buffalo is on the Great Lakes. It's not on the coast, so it's not as much of a flood risk, but we still very much have issues with flooding in the city. The reason you don't see as much flooding on Buffalo's east side is that we buried the Jackroot Creek in the 1800s, and so it flows underneath the city. But it does occur in low areas under rail bridges, which can cause issues of emergency access during storm events. It should also be noted that Buffalo has a combined storm sewer, which means that during high precipitation events, sewage gets flushed out into the creeks and rivers. I also want you to take a sec to think back to that map of all the big industrial facilities that are operating. So a lot of that is along the waterfronts in our area. So when those flood, it can cause contamination to spread like throughout the neighborhood. And I also want you to think about like that while we see the floodwater on surface, that means that the groundwater the groundwater table has risen. So during flood events, when that groundwater rises, all those contaminants that you saw on like all those like sites that are getting cleaned up, those can also bubble to the surface. So this is part of what led to the Love Canal crisis in Niagara Falls. The chemicals have been leaching from those drums under Love Canal neighborhood for years and years. And it was like bubbling to the surface periodically. But when the blizzard of 1977 hit, all of that snow melt caused the groundwater table to rise, which meant that all of a sudden all these like chemicals were leaching into people's homes all at once. And that's like when the resident-led environmental justice campaign their work kicked into high gear. Okay. So, where we're going with this is redlining, right? We all like, I assume everybody here is basically familiar with this concept. Read The Color of Law if you haven't. There's also this really great website from the University of Richmond, Mapping Inequality. So there's Buffalo's redlining map. This is like a document that we pulled from that website. And this is like the comments for that one redlining section you see there, in the city, Buffalo's downtown. And you can see it's very discriminatory language. And this language also made its way into land deeds, like for folks like in our region. So you were not only could you not get a loan, you also couldn't move to other areas of the region. And this has had like impacts for generations now. That it's led to like inequalities that persist today. So here is a story map website from a couple of researchers at the geography department at Buffalo State University. So here is a map of race. Darker green means greater number of people who identify as white alone. Here's income. Darker green means that there's more income, and like lighter green means there's less income. And ultimately, here's health outcomes. So green represents better expected health outcomes. Purple represents worse. So this systemic discrimination, it lasts to this day in our land choice uses and our investment choices, and it's deadly, especially with climate change now also impacting us. So as a lifelong upstate New York resident who's been through dozens of blizzards, I thought I knew what to expect with the Christmas blizzard of 2022, but even I found myself caught off guard by how fierce this storm was. I was relatively safe and warm with plenty of like supplies in my home. Like the power occasionally flickered, but never went out at my house. But a lot of people were not as lucky as I was. So this is from an after report from the Wagner School at NYU, which was published in June 2023. And this count, does not account for like all the deaths that occurred from the storm. There were a lot of people whose deaths were attributed to other causes, like underlying health conditions, that I feel personally like that they should have been counted towards like the ultimate like cost of the storm. So race and class and the choices about land use and investments absolutely played a factor in the deaths and destruction of the storm. So here's a couple maps of the power outages. On the one on the left there is by income, and the one by right is by race. So just to zoom in on that second map, you can see the number of outages were definitely heavily concentrated on Buffalo's east side, which is predominantly Black. And here is the storm, the deaths that were mapped, overlaid by percentage of the population identifies as Black. And that Main Street divide is right there. It's very clear that the underlying environmental justice concerns and disinvestment concerns led to quite a number of like additional deaths, from this climate change worsened storm. Okay. So we're going to jump to the town of Tonawanda, which is just to the north of the city. So here is Tonawanda. You can see City Buffalo is just to the south here. And then this is the River Road corridor that I talked about before. That big black splotch there is Tonawanda Coke. It was a coking operation. That's you bake coal to make coke, which is used in the production of steel. And it was a bad operation, just the long and short. It had been there for about a century, and it caused like a number of health concerns. So here, just an example, like that bottom chart there, that is the benzene levels. EPA, like the standards are 30 UG, is considered like a safe level of exposure. And you can see like when our campaign work started out, Tonawanda was emitting twice that safe level for public, for the public health. And this community was like very close to where a number of residential neighborhoods are. This industrial site. You can see like, so those are the stacks in the back there on that photo. And in the front, that is a playground, where like kids were playing and like being exposed to the emissions from this site. It was also like a number of like workers who were killed on this site. It was like a number of people who were sickened, in this site. We're never going to know how many like deaths are attributable to this site, or the number of like people who were exposed to harms. So very quickly, these are three guys that are affiliated with this site. The guy on the left there, that is John Crane. He was the owner of Tonawanda Coke. He died at the age of 92 while on vacation in Bolivia. He was never charged for any of his actions related to Tonawanda Coke. The guy in the middle is Paul Safran, who is John Crane's grandson. He took over ownership when John Crane died. He's known as a philanthropist in the community. He sold most of the brownfield site to a developer, at a loss, but it meant he got out, like he and his family got out of any responsibility. And he still owns a portion of like the former Tonawanda Coke site with a company that builds Coke ovens. And the guy on the right there, that is Mark Hommeltz. He was the manager of environmental control at Tonawanda Coke, and was the person who got charged the most for the actions of Tonawanda Coke. He faced 97 months of incarceration, ultimately was sentenced to 12 months. The corporation itself originally was facing $57 million in fines, and was only ordered in the end to pay $24 million. $3 million of that went to the state of New York and the United States government. $8 million went to Tonawanda Coke, right back to them to tell them to make upgrades to their equipment that they didn't want to do. $12 million went to a local research institution to do long-term public health studies and soil testing, but only $1 million went to the community benefit, of which $900,000 was ultimately distributed. So when I talk to residents today, they feel they're glad the facility is gone, but they, are a bit dispirited by how things settled out. That playground equipment is still there, and it's, they feel that it's contaminated because of all the plastic equipment that's been soaking up those air emissions through the years. And somehow that $900,000, wasn't enough to there wasn't enough in that pot to replace that playground equipment. So when we think about environmental justice, I think we need to think beyond the typical American justice system, which really focuses on punitive action. We need to think about either restorative justice, which focuses on restoring victims to their previous state prior to that harm, or even better, transformative justice, which takes things one step further. Rather than trying to restore the previous state of the victim, acknowledge that things can never be the same, and work to ensure that not only is the victim, in a settled place, but also so that the harm is eliminated and that can never be perpetuated again. So it circles back to that just transition framework. Okay. So around the same time as the Tonawanda Coke campaign was going on, there was also a coal-fired power plant, Huntley Energy, 800 megawatts, coal-fired, opened in 1916. And by 2010, there was a recognition that was going to be closing because of the market forces, that renewables were plummeting in cost and maintaining this facility was unsustainable. So, we needed to come up with like some ideas for like what happens next, between the closure of these two large facilities. So we worked with a number of stakeholders to develop the Tonawanda Tomorrow Plan. It was a strategic plan rooted in just transition, which is based on like how do we move this this municipality away from this extractive economy into a new regenerative economy. And there were a number of like really great outcomes from that plan. But one of the key action steps was to upgrade the zoning code and the zoning map that originated from the 1940s. It was like, just recognizing that we got to make some changes to, to address like the new needs of the community. So here's the old zoning map, and here's the new zoning map that emerged a couple of years later. And I'm going to point out like there's a couple of like residential communities, as I mentioned. Like one of them is in that industrial corridor. It's old workforce housing from World War II. The other one is like right, just adjacent across the highway, and is also in the middle of like industrial areas. And there wasn't a lot that changed, for like as far as the zoning for those areas, like they're still in the industrial area. And note that all those single family homes, like it was still kept single family. So, like there was, definitely some improvement with the zoning map, but there were things that we recognized, with the new zoning map and the new zoning code that, needed to be adjusted to really be equitable. So, very quickly, I came on staff in fall 2021. August 2023, the news code and the map comes out. So we did like some quick scrambling to try and identify where those tweaks need to be made. So one of the key things we really wanted to emphasize is the creation of an environmental justice overlay. New York, New Jersey has like some environmental justice like provisions within their zoning code that we looked at. There's also this really great report from the Tishman Environment and Design School at the new school in New York City, which just does like a holistic look at like what's out there. But there's a lot of like very basic things like people should be notified, of like when industrial facilities are being expanded, what are the safety things that are in place, like what should they do in case of a spill, that sort of thing. And there's also like should be a strong emphasis on anti-displacement as these areas are being redeveloped, as this corridor transitions away from heavy industry, like right along the water there, towards like, a reuse that's more, community like oriented. So there's a lot of things we, suggested in there. We also reached out to Smart Growth America, who submitted comments to the code based on our request, which really emphasized, like that's, like these anti-displacement measures, as well as like really establishing more green space to address like flooding that is increasing in the town of Tonawanda. And we also, pointed to this new zoning, this new law that has been passed in New York State, which, makes it so that you can't just, put all these industrial facilities in one community. It needs to be, you need to be considering disparate impact on communities when you're considering a plant expansion or a plant, like a new facility being built. So we sent all these comments to the planning office as the process stated. And when the meeting came along for the final version, none of the adjustments were made. I think there's a number of reasons why, but I think just in just to be frank, like, planners are humans just like anybody else. They're workers just like anybody else. Sometimes stuff falls through the cracks, and there's just some deadlines that needed to be met. There was a moratorium that was expiring, so they needed to like make some moves pretty quickly. Otherwise, that they would have like lost some leverage with like for future development. So this flawed, but ultimately like an improved code, over the one that had been there was approved to meet that immediate need. But we did get concessions from the town officials, like from that point. Some of the things we pointed out was that, like they're carrying forward a discriminatory de facto ban on drag performances. So we had like a drag performer who, came and performed at the town hearing to point out that it's like, we are allowing these industrial facilities to be next to these residential neighborhoods, but somehow, somebody reading a storybook dressed in drag is not allowed under the zoning code. So, like there's a number of changes, the things we pointed to like that. And we're forging forward. We're going to, fight for, these changes through the legislative process, as well as the upcoming comprehensive planning process that's going to kick off like within the next year or so. So just some quick, like wrap up lessons, just don't give up, move along, keep moving it, and, be bold with your work. And yeah, with that, go Bills, and thank you for your time.
Everyone for all the engagement throughout. The questions and the dialogue has been really incredible. Jeff had to step out, so we have logged the questions for him, which came through, and we'll see if we can get those addressed in the follow-up materials after the webinar. So for now, we will bring things all together by hearing more from Bridge as well as from Joseph on our upcoming report. So please feel free to add additional questions into the Q&A function. And before we kind of step back bigger picture, Bridge, I had to ask, it's really inspiring to hear from you, just to hear your commitment to the city and the region and the like layers of history and land use policy and discriminatory policy that you walked us through. Can you tell us a little bit about how you stepped into this position and became an advocate? Because in listening, it's clear you're meant to be there, and I think it'd be great for everyone on the call to hear how you got there.
Yeah, so yeah, I started planning like in the late 2010s. So like I was of course aware community organizing was a potential career path, but it was you're reading about like, hearing about how like former President Obama, started his career out as a community organizer that really like kind of inspired me to like pursue it as a career path. And I, got into like the nonprofit world, in Buffalo, did the AmeriCorps program, with a few organizations and kind of like dipped my feet into the work there. And Clean Air was one of the organizations that really inspired me to come out this way because I was reading all about like all the work that was happening here that, and was very like forward thinking, like, that they were some of the first to be talking about the just transition work. So it's, you started out volunteering with them and eventually, like this position actually, came up that it was like, that they were looking for somebody who had like that basic understanding of organizing, but also that more, like understanding of like how government works, that, like, and how like those processes are available. And yeah, so that just stepped in there at that point.
Hey, well, thank you for sharing that. And I think we were especially excited to feature Clean Air Coalition with the city of Cambridge, knowing the leadership that Clean Air Coalition has taken on mitigation and environmental justice, and then complementing that with a lot of that climate adaptation leadership that we heard about from Jeff addressing flooding, urban heat island, and other hazards. So to pull some of the topics together that we've heard about today, and to give a shout out to Kate here in the chat. We have someone, hometown. Is it what's the correct phrase for Buffaloan? Is that
Buffalonian.
Buffalonian. So we've got a hometown Buffalonian in the chat. I think part of our inspiration at SGA to put together this Climate Havens report was, hearing in the news the number of communities that have stated, hey, we're open for business for climate migration, come here, et cetera. And we were hearing, mayors, sustainability directors, chambers of commerce, kind of making this call. And we're not always seeing it being backed up with pro-housing initiatives to preserve affordability, small business support. So it'd be great to hear from you from your perspective. Buffalo is one of the cities that has gotten national news headlines for being a potential haven, as well as other communities in upstate New York. How do you think the region is doing, and what is the conversation locally about this topic?
Yeah. So I think, like the term climate haven is like it's not accurate, right? It's like, what we're talking about here is that some places will be safer, like we're talking about harm reduction, is what we're talking about here. Like Buffalo is definitely feeling the impacts of climate change, as is the rest of Western New York. And, it's like I've just in the last 10 years, I've seen like a lot of the weather patterns like get much more violent and much more dangerous in the city. We also we're not set up for hot weather. Like most of the houses here don't have like they don't have insulation. They were built it's some of the oldest housing stock in the nation. So these houses were built like just thrown up, and heat was relatively cheap. So people just like would heat their homes and would do their best like through the winter, even though it was very cold here. It was just like it was not insulated the way like modern homes are. So there's a lot of retrofitting that's happening with homes around here and with buildings around here. Some of that, like I said, is insulating. Some of it's replacing lead pipes. Some of it is getting your equipment off the ground, because flooding is very much a problem. And I think like there is starting to now be a recognition that we need to be building more housing. When I first moved to Buffalo, we were still in this middle of this demolition spree where we were just like like leveling entire blocks of vacant housing rather than trying to like fix up that housing. So I think we've turned that curve, that we're starting to like focus more on like trying to like do some infill, as well as like like fixing up the housing that we have, because we are starting to see a growing population. At the same time, a lot of that population are refugees and immigrants, and so there's a question of like is that growth going to be sustainable with the changes that are happening federally, or is it the demographics that I've seen is that when people are forced to move from climate change, they don't move too far, like they move like 100 miles. They move to like where a family member lives, like on the other side of the state. They don't necessarily move like from Florida to upstate New York. Like it's a question of like, recognizing like what is the reality here? How long of a time frame are we thinking here? 200 years from now, Buffalo could have like, could be a huge city. But today, I don't think we're going to see like that influx immediately, in the short term.
Right. Thank you. And I relate to, some of the reflections you shared there. I'm here in the room with the team today, but I live up in Vermont, which is often, titled a climate haven state, but it's also a state with many of the historic settlements right on riverbanks. So, the settlements themselves and the centers of economic activity are extremely vulnerable. I'll turn to Joseph here. We're just both reflecting on these examples from the Northeast. Did other case studies bubble up for you in working on this report?
Yeah, slide right back into you here. So like in our report, we did include a lot of policy highlights from around the country. Like Bridge said, a lot of people aren't necessarily moving cross country if they experience a climate event or their insurance gets too expensive or anything like that. They're moving maybe 100 miles away. Even with Katrina in New Orleans, a lot of people went to Houston. I don't think anyone would necessarily call Houston a climate haven, but it was nearby and a lot of people went there. So a lot of our recommendations are framed in a way that it would be helpful for climate havens, but you're not just a climate haven if you proclaim yourself to be one, or if a researcher labels you one. Sometimes you become a climate haven because something happens nearby, right? So a lot of these recommendations are still applicable and still worth thinking about, especially considering all the other co-benefits they have.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to roll up a couple questions in the chat for Bridge, and then we can also reflect on them from the Smart Growth America perspective. We have a question both around what coalition building, what methods have you used with the Clean Air Coalition to bring people together and to advocate and make change on a land use and zoning reform front. And then I think that connects well to like how are you and other community-based organizations continuing to operate and advance the mission in the environment that we're in right now. So I'll turn it to you, Bridge, and then we can chime in and also welcome thoughts in the chat too around how different organizations are coalition building and moving this work forward right now.
Yeah. So coalition building, it all comes back, to relationship building, is that you need to be establishing trust with these potential partners, and establishing these shared goals and values. Sometimes it doesn't make sense necessarily to create a coalition, even if it's a shared, goal in mind. It might make sense just to do, a loose affiliation, that it's just we have a very short-term thing, that we got to address. Let's just all sign on a letter together, and push this through as fast as we can. Coalitions, in my mind, at least, it's a longer-term process. And it's often very different partners. So the work that we've done that led to the name of our organization is we've built coalitions with local labor organizations as well as friendly businesses. Obviously the residents of these communities, trying to bring them all together collectively for that really deep democracy work and that long-term vision work. And it's hard, it's probably it's some of the hardest type of community organizing you can do, because it's a lot of people with very different stakes, in this issue. But ultimately, everybody is forging forward with a shared vision of the world they want to get to, set about group norms, that you want to work with, so it's how are you keeping stack in meetings, and that sort of thing. How are you making sure everybody's voices are heard and their concerns are all heard and integrated into the final decisions? And fighting for a shared set of goals that you all agree to, and tapping in then once you have that diverse group of stakeholders, just all the different assets and strengths that those groups have. So with Tonawanda-Coke, we worked pretty closely, and still do, with the U.S. Steelworkers, and they had a number of workers on site who were able to kind of let us know that, hey, you should look, at this issue that we have concerns about around worker safety, and we recognize that it has these other impacts with community safety and with public health and environmental consequences. So it's not always natural allies, sometimes you find yourself you know, standing on a stage with like somebody you don't necessarily agree with, like, you know, even 90% of the time. But, you know, on that 10%, you know, like where you can, you know, agree, like that something is done, you know, it's, you know, like, you know, it like that gives you an extra power, you know, an ability to move forward that you wouldn't necessarily have. So.
I think that like issue-based activism and coalition building is something which resonates with us organizationally as we, you know, bring together a lot of different organizations that, yeah, may not all, they shouldn't agree all on everything. Then why would there need to be so many different organizations? But we're all working towards some shared goals. And one which I think is forefront for us right now is housing. We're in the, you know, biggest housing access crisis that's been seen in generations, and we can't just sit around and wait. We have to work with, you know, work with partners to see what solutions can be advanced local and state level, but also, you know, what is possible at the federal level. There's a question as well around, you know, working in this environment. We, you know, regularly partner with and support community-based organizations, including many which are, you know, we're planning to move forward big projects with big funding behind them, which may no longer be available. So something which, you know, we're often, working with community partners to do is to think, okay, what other types of partners and entities can come into the mix here? Which aspects of this project can move forward now at a lower dollar value, you know, rather than waiting for what's that big funding source that is going to come in and cover this ambitious project that we want to see happen. You know, what can we do to keep moving forward so we're in the best possible position as we're able to identify resources. I can't believe an hour and a half has wrapped up so quickly. This has been an amazing roster, and I want to thank everyone for such engaged dialogue, great questions, and thank you, Bridge, and you, Joseph, for presenting today. And for everyone whose questions were not answered, again, we're going to do our best to address them in post-event materials, and also to like take them on board as we're designing future research, technical assistance, and webinar programming. So with that, I'll pass it back to Tokara Nicole Thomas to wrap us up. Thank you, everyone.
Again, I want to just say a big hearty thank you to all of our speakers for their deep presentations. Bridge as well, you gave us some really good technical information, but you really made it relatable. And I know for me, what definitely resonated was the quote that change is inevitable, justice is not. Something that also resonated for me from Jeff's conversation was the really big focus on prioritization. We have to do the zoning anyway, but let's know what the community wants and let's prioritize there. And then from Joseph and Catherine's presentation and discussion, climate havens, you might not be one now, but you could be one in the future. So I think I inferred this from your conversation. So us giving you all those technical details and those action steps to be able to get ready for it, because climate change is now and the events are only going to get worse. So I am very much appreciative to all of our speakers and also to you all for joining us and sharing your time with us, sharing your deep, thought-provoking conversations and questions. And on that note, for next steps, you will receive a wrap-up email. We will share out the speakers' presentations as PDFs. We'll also share out their contact information, given that they've been comfortable in flagging that Bridge drop their email address in the chat now. We'll respond to any questions in that wrap-up email that we didn't get a chance to get to. And then we'll also give a special preview invite to you all as participants. If you would like to be a first reader or first reviewer, if you will, of the upcoming Climate Havens report, we'll give you an opportunity in the wrap-up email to kind of give us your contact information and connect with you there. I also want to flag that we dropped the survey in the link in the chat. Please take that Google survey. It is very short. I believe it takes 2-3 minutes, but that feedback is invaluable and it helps us to be able to continue bringing this type of content and to continue improving. Feedback is a gift and that's how we grow. So final two reminders. Again, this will be eligible for AICP CM credits if you would like to go after those, and that'll be in the wrap-up email as well. And then as a reminder, we have those save the dates for the coming up webinars. We'll put those tentative dates in the emails as well. And again, landing plane on 1:30 on the dot. Thank you all again. And we're going to officially close out our webinar today. So we really appreciate you all for your time and your attention and your questions. Thank you again.